First of all, thank you everybody for coming to today's webinar on how to conduct effective dismissals. My name is Christelle Wren and I am the Chief Operating Officer here at HRLocker. We have the fabulous Frederica Shepherd with us today. And as always, I also have Jenny with me, who is manning the Q&A session. So if anybody has any questions throughout, please pop a question into the questions and answers section. And if you have any questions about anything, put them in there and I'll try to fire them at Frederica. She's in the hot seat today as we go. So I suppose, Frederica, before we start, do you want to maybe just talk about yourself, your background, and a little bit about voltage management as well?
Yeah, delighted to, Crystal, and thanks so much for the invitation to join you today, and of course to Jenny and Nikki in the background who've made it all possible. So I am a managing director of Voltage Management. We're a HR consultancy, but I cut my teeth in HR in a number of different industries down through the years. Voltage is around almost 14 years. We started in 2011 with my business partner, Joyce Rigby-Jones. So I have worked in the field of HR, in US manufacturing, software, financial services, and I would say the one thing that really is common, and I see it especially in my consulting role, is people management is challenging, it's demanding, and irrespective of the sector you're in, there's a key people engagement, good process, culture and values that kind of underlines all of the HR related matters. And so really looking forward to getting into this hot topic of dismissal. It instills fear and anxiety in all HR professionals, I think, but at the same time, it's a real feature of the work we do and the environment we work in. So I think it's good for us just to step through it and, blend obviously the legal principles with some practical, good natural justice principles associated with it as well.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that that's the kind of focus that we're hoping to do today, is kind of go through it step by step and give a kind of good explanation about the different areas. So I suppose if we start at the beginning, Frederica, there are the legal grounds of dismissal. If you want to maybe bring us through that from the basic step one.
Yeah, so I suppose the legal grounds for dismissal in Irish employment law, anything that goes forward to the WRC where an employee has had 12 months continuous service will be considered unfair. It'll fit within the unfair dismissals legislation 1977, and it'll be presumed unfair because the burden of proof is on the employer. So the employer has to show that the dismissal was fair, there was fair procedure, fair selection, or whatever it is. So I'd say, the grounds for dismissal tend to fall within, I suppose, the conduct of an individual, the capability or competency, or it could be down to something like a redundancy. So if we don't have a true redundancy, or if we don't make a fair selection, then the dismissal of somebody through redundancy is considered to be an unfair dismissal. So that's where I suppose the legal grounds of dismissal. And of course, that's with 12 months plus service. However, in certain situations, the 12 months window, the dismissal could be considered unfair, especially if we were in breach of any of our equality legislation around age, race, colour, sexual orientation, things like that. If the dismissal formed a reason around trade union affiliation or membership, if the dismissal had anything to do with pregnancy or post-maternity matters, then it would be, it could potentially fall within unfair dismissal. Or if the parties involved, the employee involved, was involved in some sort of a legal matter with the company or the employer around legal proceedings or whatever, and they ended up being dismissed, that could be considered unfair. And of course, the whole area around exercising one's right to health and safety, and whistleblowing. So, there's two pieces to this. There's a 12-month window that constitutes where individuals are protected under the unfair dismissals legislation, but then there's a whole set of other circumstances where the 12 months isn't required, and that's where we have to make sure that we are following good practice and due process.
Yeah, and I think that's the key, Frederica, isn't it? That in terms of there are legal grounds for dismissals, but there is a process to follow. There are things to be taken into consideration throughout the process, and even if something happens in regards to the catching somebody red-handed, for example, with their hand in the till, there is a process to follow. Even though there may be specific legal grounds, there is a process to follow after that, which is really important to make sure that you're not seen to be kind of unfair in any way.
Exactly. Yeah, due process and natural justice underpins all of these decisions.
Yeah. So I suppose, what does a fair dismissal look like then, if you've done everything correctly?
Yeah, and I would say this is where, the Code of Practice on Grievance and Disciplinary Procedures really comes into their own, because they're the things that we lean on heavily to give us a good pathway in making those informed decisions, but following good practice. Okay, so some of the fundamentals around that and those principles of natural justice really relate to, that any sort of details about an alleged complaint or matter, that the complainant has the right to put their case forward. Okay, so they have the right to respond, and that the employee concerned has been given the opportunity to obviously avail of representation. So that means that they can come to any of those meetings with a colleague or a trade union representative. And that the employee concerned has the right to fair and impartial determination on the issues concerned. So that means that, you're taking into account any representation or anything that should be considered or evaluated as having merit on the whole decision-making process associated with the circumstances leading up to an incident, or factual information about somebody's record, medical certs, or something like that. So it's really important that we can recognize that, what comes to us, and everybody here this morning will be very familiar with this from a HR point of view. Very often what comes to us as the original complaint, once we step back from it and actually we try and establish, well, what actually happened, who were the parties involved, when did it happen, where was it, all of that, we often start to establish that, that first statement that was made by somebody may not have captured the issue in its entirety. So I think that's where, who handles that first point of contact, who supports the parties involved. And there's really good, obviously, codes of practice in relation to, harassment and sexual harassment and bullying in the workplace. And, there are different policies to what we're talking about here in relation to grievance and disciplinary. But like everything in people management, it's not one-dimensional. We have to make sure that we factor in all aspects and that we're giving good account of the underlying company policies and procedures and fair procedure. So, it is important that nobody comes into a disciplinary meeting not aware of why, or not provided with the opportunity to be represented, or not given enough time to be prepared and brief themselves. So that level of reasonableness up front is really important. And we'll get into this a little bit as we go, Christelle, but I would say, definitely, we would see it sometimes maybe in our consulting practice, is that, a manager comes to the table and wants a quick decision because they have reached the decision point. Okay. And rushing a decision on anything to do with dismissal, I think, is not to be advised, because there's so many landmines there that I think could significantly impact you. So I would definitely recommend upfront, get all the details lined up, know exactly what you're dealing with, be well informed, and then lead out following a good structured process to manage and engage in all of this. And the code of practice that's been there a long time on grievance and disciplinary certainly has, survived the test of time, and we all still reference this. So this is the fundamentals of all of our policies, is going back to the codes of practice in relation to grievance and disciplinary.
Yeah, and I wonder, Frederica, you were talking about there that a lot of the time a manager is looking for a real quick response, or they probably had this for a couple of weeks. Do you often find that sometimes when HR gets involved, or it gets elevated to now that it is becoming a dismissal process, that what actually has happened in the last month or two kind of starts to arise, that maybe there has been some issues, that there have been some conversations, that it's all kind of bubbled up to now being a dismissal process? But a lot of the time the manager kind of thinks, well, I've done this for the last 2 months, so I need to make this decision now. But really the process is only starting now, right?
Well, that's exactly it, Christella. I think that's where, sometimes there's misalignment with what the policies in action really mean. And, anyone engaged in managing people who have responsibility for making decisions really need to be absolutely familiar and competent on this area. So it's not something I would suggest any individual goes forward and makes a decision on without good consultation with others, and without the opportunity to test yourself, test the process you followed. Are you objective in your decision? This idea of being judge and jury is definitely not to be advised either. So have we all the objective information and material that we need? Was it necessary for an independent investigation? Or, did I hear the complaint? Did I do the investigation? Did I determine the outcome? And
judge and jury.
Now, am I going to go ahead and dismiss? So again, depending on the size of your organization, you mightn't have all those different layers or all those different stakeholders around you to help you with this. But this is really, really critical that you follow the practice correctly and you follow the procedure. So it's all very well having a policy in your handbook that either nobody has seen for many years, or nobody understands how to use it, or it's such legal jargon that really people don't engage with it. That in itself will not be your card to get out of jail, right?
Yeah.
It is important that these things are practical, that they're communicated. I would say don't wait until you have a crisis within a team or within the organization to make sure that this is all communicated. If you're communicating your handbook policies and procedures on an ongoing basis, you're reminding people maybe on a regular basis that maybe there's an update or something like that, then that means people are comfortable using the handbook. And that's really what you want within your organization, is that people see it as a good guide to working here in this company, not as a stick to either beat somebody else or to catch out my employer. It really should be a good guide to how I need to show up, how I need to participate as a member of this organization, and what I can expect from my employer. So, underpinning good policies and procedures all the way through the relationship between an employer and an employee.
Yeah, and I just have a question here, Frederica, and I'm wondering, this has actually come up a couple of times, just in general, I suppose, throughout my time working as well, is, you've said here that people can be represented by a union rep or a colleague. If you've started a dismissal, have had that clear, you're about to start, you've had that clear meeting with the individual to say, this is a disciplinary meeting, and they come in and say that they want to bring a solicitor in with them. what I suppose would you advise around that? Would you kind of say no to that, or say, I suppose there seems to be a larger issue here.
Yeah, and I'd say maybe we get a little anxious about that because it's not a courtroom, and sometimes we feel that when legal representatives become part of a meeting or a discussion, that it can become very legalistic and that they maybe they direct the conversation. So I'd say there's a few things to consider in this. First of all, if this is a really serious issue and has the likelihood to be considered gross misconduct and has the likelihood to go to a dismissal, I would say it's probably reasonable for you to allow the individual to have legal representation. Okay, because it's so serious. And the good thing about the individual having legal representation in a matter like that, their legal advisor will be realistic about the terms of the issue. Okay, so that's one thing I'd say. The other thing I would say is, remember, you're the one managing this process. You're the one chairing this meeting, or you're the one directing proceedings as to, this is the process we're following, here's the timelines, here's what's going to happen. So, stay anchored in your role. That's important. And I think when we're really clear about what we're doing and how we're doing it, then who the employees or who the parties have as representatives doesn't become as big a distraction. Because the whole idea of why it's important to have representation with you at meetings like this is to support you to bring forward a good defense, or to bring forward a good complaint, or to bring forward whatever the issue is. So all parties obviously have that right. So if you're really going to oversee a fair process that's transparent and that you're happy to stand over, then it's okay to have them with people participating and supporting them. Now, it's the participation piece, I think, is maybe one to clarify up front as well. At a meeting like this, it is the employee who's representing, or who presents themselves, who interfaces and answers the questions. Now, if for some reason the individual is exceptionally nervous, is suffering from stress and anxiety, is experiencing, significant trauma associated with this whole thing, you might need to actually pause this process and make sure that the parties are certified fit to participate in a process like this. Okay. Now, that might not be what your manager who's trying to get to a decision wants to hear from you as a HR point of view, but that might well be the right thing to do. So if you're going to have parties participating in a situation that could end up in their dismissal, that's really serious. You need to make sure that you're giving the environment and creating the setting for absolute fairness and for participation by everybody. So you want whoever is there in a position responding to the allegations, defending their position, putting forward their side of the story, to do that in a meaningful way. All right. So on that basis, we need to make sure that we're creating the right environment. So there are just some things to check in the lead up to kicking off a process.
That's a really good point. I think if you're just going back to that fair procedure, there's an interesting question here, and I'm just wondering how it would affect the environment. Una says, if the employee chooses to bring a solicitor, you've allowed them to do that. And actually, I think the key word here is to represent them, which I think that you would say they're not representing them; they're just coming with them. Should you bring the company solicitor with you as well?
I think it's always important when you have a really important meeting, a serious meeting, to have a balanced environment. Okay. And I would say generally, if there is going to be a solicitor in the room for one party, it probably makes sense that there is a legal representative for the other side as well. So remember, you know, depending on what's leading up to this, if it's a grievance, if it's going through the disciplinary process, what you don't want, I suppose, and again, this is coming back to that piece of anchoring, if you're the one managing this process, being really clear with all the parties, their role in this process and what's expected. So while the employee might have a solicitor and they're just there as a kind of a witness or as a support figure or whatever, then that's the case for the company solicitor. If the company solicitor is there, you actually don't want it to become a quasi courtroom and for the solicitors to take over and start, you know, legal argument on various different matters. This is still a process that's internal. Okay, so it's important that there's the freedom for the individuals to express what they need to express, to share the information. No decision is made yet, but if there's going to be legal argument about what somebody said or why you're putting that forward at that early stage, then that's not actually the spirit of the procedure either. You know, you might get to something like that at a point where a decision is made and you're going through an appeal process. You know, but this is still a process where you haven't made a decision. You're still gathering all the information and you want to try to get to a point where you're going to get to an informed decision. But hopefully, if you've done all this groundwork, that decision will become the most apparent thing in the end.
Yeah, and I think just a really key thing you said there, which is really interesting, is that the solicitor isn't there to represent. You're not going into court, both sides. They're just there to accompany. Okay, I'm just going to move on to the next. I suppose we're talking about different types of dismissals here. So in terms of performance dismissals, I suppose you want to go through a bit how you would do that.
Yeah, and I'd say, look, this is probably one of the more common ones that we would use the disciplinary process on, you know, because performance is a feature of, you know, any environment. But it's obviously very structured as well. And poor performance can be considered as a misconduct. I suppose that's just to say that. But we have to get behind that a little bit and understand, well, what brought us to this point, you know? So there has to be obviously reasonable engagement with the individual to give them every opportunity to be successful in their job. Have they had the right training? Have they been in a supportive environment? Have they had the right tools to do the job? So that, you know, the manager is just not saying that this person is not performing and I want to terminate them. So, you know, have they been set up for success is a really big piece of that. And that's what we have to make sure we check. But also we don't go straight into the disciplinary process when somebody's showing signs of maybe poor performance or there's some difficulties around their productivity or their quality or something like that. We actually start to alert them to that fact and we actually give them the hard evidence. So we show them what is presenting, you know, if it's an attendance issue or if it is that they're, you know, the quality of their work, or if it is that, you know, just they're not completing tasks to the standard required. We need to show that to them. And we also equally need to show them what good looks like. Here's what I did expect. Now, if they say something like, well, I didn't know that, I thought I was only to bring it to this stage, then you couldn't enter into a disciplinary process because now there's been misalignment in expectation. But if you can clearly prove that actually, well, I did in the first month sit down with you and we went through this and I have it documented and I sent it to you and, you know, we talked about it after the first 2 weeks and you said you understood, then that's different because now you've got supporting evidence to say that actually you have set expectations and that there's a clear gap in what you expected, what you requested, and what is actually being delivered. But even at that point, if there is a clear gap and everybody's is upfront about that, you probably would go into that kind of informal counselling piece where you're actually saying to the person, look, I really need you to focus in on this area. This is really important. And if this standard of work doesn't improve, we are either entering into a performance improvement plan, which could result in a disciplinary process, which could result in dismissal ultimately. And so I want you to take this matter really seriously. So we're going to sit down again in 2 weeks' time, and I'm going to look at what I hope will be an area of improvement between now and when we meet again in 2 weeks. So again, I think you're trying to give the individual full ownership of their performance, so uncomplicated language, clear messaging, and remember what we say verbally needs to be followed up with writing. So put that into an email. And if it's somebody that's on a manufacturing floor, doesn't have access to email all the time, then actually give it to them in a letter so that they actually have the physical, they can review that again. Because when we're stressed and when we're under pressure and when we're in an environment that we're uncomfortable with, we don't always hear all the details. And if our manager or our team lead is talking to us about poor performance, we probably are going to have heightened anxiety around that. So we mightn't hear all the details. And that's where I think it's important for the manager to recognize that as well and make sure that what you communicate, you're giving it in different forums so that they have every opportunity to understand what's expected.
And we're going back, Frederica, then to that fair process. That's the key, right? Is that you're
groundwork.
Doing it fair. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, that groundwork. The more you put into the groundwork, the better. Honestly, the rest will come smooth enough, I think. Mm-hmm. But the more planning, the more structure, the pacing of the stages, the better. And so you might well get to the stage where you need to put a performance improvement plan in place. Now, there's lots of people that have never even heard of that. And there's, what does that mean? So you need to bring them through that. Now, you might have something in the policy, in the handbook about it, but again, that could have been something somebody glanced through, they didn't know what it meant, and now suddenly they find themselves in a situation where it applies to them, so they want to pay more attention to it. So make sure you give them the opportunity for that greater information about what it is. So it's going to be a document. I'm going to be filling in details about the goals that I'm asking you to perform. I'm going to be explaining the standard that I need from those goals. I'm going to explain the timeline that I need you to get to that standard. And we're going to have a date in for when we sit down to discuss this again. Mm-hmm. So making it really, really clear. The clearer it is, the best chance the individual has of being successful. And if you really are trying to support them to be successful so that you avoid having to take it into a disciplinary process, then this is kind of like the detail that you need. And then you need to be able to explain to them. So this is what we call a performance improvement plan. Here is where it sits within the process. So we're going to invest time. Both of us are going to invest time meeting weekly for the next month or the next 2 months or whatever it is. And we're going to look at each step and each goal that I'm setting you and understand, do you need more training? Do you need some mentoring? Do you need a change of environment? Do what are the conditions that we can help you with that will result in you meeting the standard of performance that's needed?
I have 2 questions here I'm going to go to, Frederica, okay. And actually it's really, really clear in regards to the language, because both questions have used PIP. And I think that that's such something that we would throw around. We know what it means, we know what it does, but to be very clear that an employee may have never heard of that word before. So it's clear that you're actually explaining what it was. And I actually was with one company once and they were talking about getting a bomb, and they had another acronym, and that was their performance plan. And I was like, feel like,
oh my gosh, that's nuclear.
So I have 2 questions here. So in the PIP, performance improvement plan, is it up to the manager or the employee to ensure that regular check-in meetings are actually happening?
Oh, it's the manager. Yeah.
Okay.
The manager is managing the performance. So that is a requirement of a manager's role, to actually manage the performance of the individuals. And if that's not happening, it could shed some light on why performance has slipped. Mm-hmm. Because this could be an individual who actually needs structure and needs that style of engagement with their manager. and they're not getting it, and as a result they're not sure about to quantify their performance. So you might find that if actually you spend a little bit more time explaining all of this to the individual, giving them that extra support on clarity and direction, that actually they get up and running and they get into a rhythm that's really good. And if they feel empowered and they feel they're pointing in the right direction, and they can become transformed.
Yeah.
You know, so remember, the manager is responsible for that, you know, performance, productivity, all the rest of the team. And it is important for a manager to understand the dynamic and the profile of their team as well, you know.
And I think important as well that you're going into it not thinking, you know what, this improvement plan is going to fail. It's never going to work. We're really just doing this to go through the process, you know, just to get to the next stage, which really goes nicely into the next question, which is, can I apply a PIP without following the steps in grievance and disciplinary process? I suppose
you can apply,
right?
you can apply a PIP at any stage. Absolutely. You can apply a PIP during the probation period if it's relevant, or you can apply a PIP in a, you know, kind of specific project that somebody might be on or whatever. So the PIP by its nature is a performance improvement plan, and it is relevant if for some reason you think there's slippage on the attention to detail, on productivity, on performance standards, or even if you're saying that I'm actually not too sure the person is as passionate about this as they were at the start. Now, you mightn't need to go through a full performance improvement plan. You might need just to have the conversation with them and say, you know what, I'm sensing there's a shift for you in your appetite for this job, or I'm sensing that your commitment isn't quite what I thought it was at the outset. Is there something going on in the background that would help me understand and support you more?
Yeah, and I think that's key as well. It's just that communication. There's loads of questions, but we're going to switch on to the next slide, and we will get to all the questions at the end. So please keep them coming. So capability assessments, I always find this is a hard one to do, but it's really ensure it's important if you're going down the street that you're doing it properly, right?
Oh, completely. I think this one really could be very tricky, and I think that's where we need to be able to call out what it is, you know. So are we saying that the person either doesn't have the skill or the aptitude or whatever to do the job? Now, if we hired them on the assumption that they had, but are they not presenting with that ability, or for some reason is it not showing up? And what might that be? Is it a physical issue, or is it, you know, kind of a work environment? Because, you know, if we're in a situation where our mental well-being is not great, it can be very difficult for us to perform to a certain standard. So I think it is important to be able to understand whether it is just pure performance or is it about capability. Okay, and then I think it's important to actually refine that even further. Is it that they need more training, or is it that their aptitudes, or is it there's something else going on? All right, and you know, dismissals do result in people just not having the skill set needed to do the job, or not being fit and healthy to be able to perform the requirements of the job. But that's a big decision to be made by the organization or by the manager. And I would say you definitely need the support of some external medical advice on that. So this is where you really lean on your company doctor and your occupational physician to advise you, because you are not a medical person. And I think this is where our unconscious bias could really kick in, you know, and there's all sorts of different conditions that an individual can have, and it's very important that we do not discriminate against them for any one of those things. It does not define them, and it does not mean that they don't have the ability, or that with support, they might not be able to do the job. So we need to make sure that we're providing reasonable accommodation if that's what's required, and to enable the person to do the work, because remember, we hired them. Okay.
Yeah.
Now, something of course could happen to their ability during their period of employment. And is that as a result of the workplace, or is it as a result of another incident that happened outside of the workplace? So these are all things that HR practitioners on a daily basis have to take account of, you know. We need to be the good cop, you know. We need to just calm the storm that might be raging and start looking at what is the information we know, what information don't we know, and how do we find out that information in order to make an informed decision.
I think important as well, Frederica, is that there are some protected
categories.
Categories. You know, if somebody is, you may have employed them and they would be working great for the last 5 years. Now they may have alcoholism, drug addiction, something like that. It is protected.
Yeah, that on itself is not necessarily the reason why you would dismiss. So you really need to make an informed decision. As I say, there's a lot of things you need to take into consideration, and yeah, just live your values as an employer.
Yeah. Question here, and then we'll move on to the next one, is if the employee is unfit to engage and they're currently on a paid suspension, do they move to sick leave until such time as they are fit to engage?
So if, just say that to me, they're on suspension, but they're determined unfit to engage, then they're obviously need to be medically certified. And if they're medically certified, then they're on sick leave. And
we can't continue with the dismissal process.
So no.
Or capability assessments, things like that.
That would not be fair. Yeah. And again, you know, maybe this individual needs a period of time to come back to a place where they can engage properly. And maybe they need some medical intervention. Maybe they need some therapeutic support. And remember, again, from our point of view as the employer and as HR representing the employer, we're trying to ensure fair procedure.
Yeah. Yeah, which is like I said, keep coming back to the word fair, which I just think is that's the bit
it's all over it. It's all over it. So there's a reason why there's unfair written in the legislation for unfair dismissal.
And you know what, this question I'm going to throw in here just because I think it's really relevant is, how does a manager avoid being bounced into a poor decision on dismissal by staff members who just don't like the person? And again, we're getting to that fair. You might not like everybody you work with. That doesn't mean you can just fire them.
Absolutely. So, my gosh, yeah, look, we're not always going to like each other, but you know, whether you like somebody or not doesn't mean they're going to do the job better. All right. So you might really like somebody that you might be best buddies with them, get on great, but actually, you know what, their quality of their work is awful. So that's not the measure. All right. All of this comes down to, I have a job, I've hired individual to come and perform that work. Have I created the right environment for them to do that? Have they the tools and the capability to do it? And am I creating the opportunity for them to get on and do it? Are they being supported in the right way? So whether I like you or not, it really doesn't factor in. Now, I think smaller teams, that can be an issue, but maybe what's needed there is some good teamwork, team building exercise. And maybe it's down to, maybe you need to clear the air with this individual. You know, maybe you both need to come to the table as adults and have a conversation as colleagues around, you know what, I still feel really sore because you threw out my lunch from the fridge 2 years ago, and I had to go out and buy something separately and you never said sorry. Like, you know, sometimes
things
it can
fester.
be the craziest of things that cause us to dislike an individual.
Yeah, you ate my yogurt.
Not the objective about that.
Yeah, exactly. So I hope this is like a little bit more clear cut than in terms of when we're talking about capability assessments and even performance. When you go into that misconduct and gross misconduct, I suppose, you know, now you're really just getting into process, making sure that you're doing things correctly.
Yeah. And, you know, Christelle, I'd say this just from a general observation. in reviewing policies and procedures around this. Like you'll be familiar with this, and everybody with us this morning will be familiar with this. We often have a list in our policy of, not extensive, but may include examples of what constitutes misconduct. And then we might have another list of, not exhaustive, but just these are examples of gross misconduct. Even with that in your policy, it still doesn't automatically mean that that's what it is. All right. So, for example, theft. We might have theft of company property as gross misconduct. So, you think somebody has stolen something from work, you saw it on the CCTV, and you decide that's theft. It's in our policy, it's theft. It's in our policy, it's gross misconduct. You go to the person, you say, you're dismissed for theft. On every level, that's going to be an unfair dismissal.
Yeah.
Okay. And believe it does happen, So, for example, was the CCTV allowed to be used for disciplinary matters, or is the CCTV system there for security issues? So if it's not scoped into your policy that you could use CCTV, then you can't use it. All right. As simple as that. Who says they took what and when? All right. So you need to have an investigation. And you can't be the investigator and the decision maker. So get somebody who's absolutely not involved and who knows how to carry out an investigation. Getting the term of reference right is really important. Having the minutes of the meetings, making sure they get signed off, interviewing any other stakeholders that need to be interviewed, and then coming back to you with a report from the investigation that gives you factual information. And then you can use that. All right. But you can't expect the investigator to come back and say, oh yeah, you definitely should dismiss them. Right. That's not what the term of reference should be in an investigation. All right. And then even if the investigation comes back and says, in all probability, it looks like the person did not have permission to take that item from the workplace. All right. Now you need to go through a process. So you need to be able to invite them to a disciplinary meeting. They need to have the opportunity to be represented. They need to have a copy of that investigation report. They need to be given an opportunity to respond. So you can see where there's lots of different steps that need to happen before you get to the point of saying, okay, I believe they intentionally took something without approval or without permission from the organization for their own gain, and then that's theft. Now, there could be a civil matter associated with something like that as well, like we've come across situations where there was kind of a physical assault in the workplace. And so on one hand, you might be going through a disciplinary process to determine their future and whether it will result in a dismissal. But equally, there could be a separate civil matter where the Gardaí are involved and the individuals go down that route as well. So, it can get very complex. But I think for us, from a HR point of view, if we're the people in the seat trying to manage this process, that's where we need to continue to just calibrate ourselves, check, are we doing, where are we in this process? And have I got all that information closed off to move to the next stage? And if you don't, or if you're not confident that you have, don't move to the next stage without being clear, because it'll show up somewhere else. You'll get to a final decision point and it'll go to appeal because you skipped a simple stage early on.
And do you think, Frederick, I always think a really, really just a good visual example for people is that I see Jane, I see her physically take money out of the till and leave the building with it. And I know she has stolen that. That is not grounds to fire her on that day. It just isn't.
No. And I'd say the other thing as well, sometimes we do, put somebody on suspension even paid suspension, we have to be proportionate in that as well. So if we're deciding that somebody is suspended from work, we need to make sure that we're not predetermining an outcome there. And remember, we need to ensure that the individual has every opportunity to continue to work in the place. So if we put them on paid suspension and all their colleagues immediately think that means they're guilty, it might be very difficult for them to ever return. And there's a test there as well around, is it necessary to have them on suspension? If they're at no risk to themselves, no risk to colleagues, and no risk to the business, then why are you suspending them?
Yeah, that's a good point.
So again, I think we need to just be really clear with some of that. Why are we doing those things?
Yeah. Frederic, there's a number of questions here around probation, so I'm just going to kind of push them all together, and just in regards to if somebody's in that 6 months probation period, can you still bring them under a dismissal process? Do you still have to do a dismissal process is one of the questions. We don't have a HR function, bad attendance, bad performance. Do we still need to go through the full process? Is it possible to just get rid of somebody during probation period, or do I have to go through the dismissal process?
Yeah, so in simple terms, no, you don't have to go through the dismissal process. I would say there's a few things to check. First thing is to check the probation clause in your contract. So you know that probation now is only up until 6 months, and it's only in exceptional circumstances and in the best interest of the individual that it would be extended beyond that. And, the advice legally is very much that could be in a situation where somebody's out on sick leave for much of their probation period. That might be the reason why you extend it. So before we might have, extended probation because we thought, okay, their performance isn't at the stage is that, or their timekeeping isn't at the stage that. Rather than dismissing, I'll tell them that they need to pull up their socks, and I'll give them a month to do that. So that's not the approach we're going to take anymore now with this change in the legislation. So first of all, check the clause in your probation period, because it needs to be worded in a way that you are giving yourself the freedom to dismiss for any reason and no reason. Okay, so there was a really interesting case a number of years ago where an individual was terminated during probation. Now, they didn't have the protection of the unfair dismissals case, but they took it on under one of the other grounds, and so they won their case. And they won their case on the grounds that it wasn't clearly defined in the probation period in the contract that you were not going to use the disciplinary process. So the advice at the time was anything to do with performance, where you've got factual information to support your decision, you can go ahead and dismiss. But if it's about conduct is less objective. So you might end up having to conduct an investigation in order to make a decision around dismissing for conduct during the probation period. So just to be mindful of that. Now, I think what the person who asked you the question is saying that they've got poor performance and they've got poor attendance. That is the grounds, if it's factual, for you to make a decision about they don't have a future with you. And you can communicate that to them and give them a second chance if you want. That's up to you. Or you can go to them and you can say, on the grounds of the probation clause, you have not met the requirements, and you don't have to wait till the 6 months is up. You can do it if you're finding that that's happening after month 1, month 2, 3 months in, or whatever. You can make those decisions. But again, line up all your information and be satisfied that you are making a good informed decision that you can stand over, and that you're being fair to the individual in communicating it to them.
Yeah, I suppose I'm not just relying on that. Again, Jack said that Jane's late all the time. That's, I think.
Have you seen the records? Have you seen the clock in times? Have you seen that? Because, it could be that they might have been late twice, but what were those 2 occasions when they were late? Was it that they had to take somebody to a hospital? Was it that there was a crash on the M50? They might be very justifiable reasons, and then for you to go and dismiss for that reason might be unreasonable.
Yeah, exactly. So in terms of the actual process, Frederica, do you want to maybe talk to us about it? And again, this is a defined process, right? We do have the code of practice.
Yeah.
Like you said, it's been around for a while, but it's an oldie but a goodie.
Exactly. It's a keeper. It's a keeper. So, and look, it's the basis for all of our policies and procedures in our handbooks, you know, and it's the principle of what the adjudicating officers in the WRC are going to follow, you know. So even in the absence of you having a policy and procedure, this is the guideline. You would use this code as your way to manage it. So the first thing is that, you know, you'll have that informal conversation with an individual where you actually alert them to the issue that's problematic. You make sure that they have a copy of the policy, the disciplinary policy. Make sure they understand the process and make sure they understand where they are in the process. Okay. And that you put the corrective action in place between that. If you're starting off at the informal stage, before going into verbal warning is a formal stage. Okay, so you might have a step before that. So you could call it informal or counselling or whatever. And if things don't improve and you've given them every opportunity and they're aware that it's going to move to the verbal stage, then that's what you do. So you invite them to a meeting. Remember the formality of inviting them to a meeting. You give them notice, you give them the opportunity to bring somebody with them, and you give them enough time to prepare for it. So it's not like, I come in today, I've decided that hasn't improved, I'm going to issue you with a verbal warning, come down to my office at 10 o'clock, I'm giving you a verbal warning.
Yeah.
You know, these are some of the things that we see happening. So that's not fair procedure and doesn't fit within the code of practice. Okay, even though it's a verbal warning, it's a formal part of the process. And so then you go through that process, you give them every opportunity to respond, and then you make a decision after the meeting. What level of sanction do I issue here? Have I got all the information I need to make that formed decision? And you might find that you skip the verbal warning and you go straight to written warning, depending on what the incident is, you know. So you can skip these stages to the next stage, but it has to be based on merit of the issue at hand and the information you have available to you. But normally you would go through the steps of verbal, written, final written, and dismissal. Now, a verbal warning would normally stay on a person's record for 6 months. So again, when you're issuing the verbal warning in writing, you need to alert them to that. You need to be clear about what date does that mean it's coming off your record, and it physically needs to come off their record. Okay. But if for some reason, so you might be issuing them with a verbal warning around their timekeeping and attendance. Okay. During that 6 months, something else might happen where they make a series of errors from a performance point of view, or, you know, there's some other matter that comes up that merits a disciplinary process. That's a separate process. So you don't escalate the verbal warning from the time and attendance issues. For this other issue, you start a separate process. And I think sometimes managers find that frustrating. You know, and I guess that's where we as HR practitioners need to be clear about it. That's a different process. The verbal warning on record is about their time and attendance. Now, if they have repeated time and attendance issues during that 6 months, then we will move it on to the written warning and thereon afterwards if it continues. But they're different issues. So all the way, all the way up to written warning, final written warning. Sometimes you might find that somebody might say, well, after the first written warning, we're going to leave that on file for 12 months, and the final written warning kicks in then, or you say final written warning kicks in for 12 months, and then it goes to dismissal. So you can determine some of those things yourself. There is recommendations in the guide, the code of practice, but you can, you know, make some adjustments to that so long as it's fair procedure. And again, when you get to the point of dismissal, if the person is on a final written warning, the incident has happened again, you engage with them, alert them to that fact, and you go through the same process all over again. Invitation to a disciplinary meeting. You're entitled to bring somebody with you. This is when it'll happen. Here's the information I have available to me. Please come with any information that you might have to support your situation. Be alerted that this could result in a decision around dismissal, and remind them of where they are in the process. I find that if I'm doing anything on the area of disciplinary, I repeatedly include the disciplinary policy with any correspondence to ensure that the individual absolutely knows what the procedure is and knows where they are in it, and that you don't find yourself at the end of a process saying, well, I didn't know it could result in a dismissal.
Great idea. Yeah.
Okay.
I actually think that's a very fair point, because at least then there's no time where like, oh, well, I didn't realize that.
Yeah.
I'm just going to go to one question real quick, because I just think this is an important one. It says, but you can still dismiss for no reason. So thanks for your time, but unfortunately, we're not going to continue your employment with us within the first 13 weeks. So that basically within your probation. So it's going back to their probation, which, yes, I know we've answered that yes, you can kind of, but make sure that you're actually following your fair process as well, and that you
So
have your
make
probation.
sure that you're not going to
Yeah.
fall foul of any of the 9 grounds on equality. That's the piece that could be really tricky. So is there anything about this individual where they have any form of a disability or a medical issue, or are they protected under maternity, or any of those sort of things? Just make sure that you're on safe grounds.
Yeah, and I think that that's often misleading, Frederica, that to like probation. Yes, there is that they're in probation, but if Jane comes to work one day and you just say, you know what, we don't want you anymore, and she's pregnant, or she's an alcoholic, or she's something, you need to make sure that you've got all your I's dotted and T's crossed, right?
Absolutely, because remember, they don't need the 12 months protection to be unfairly treated there.
Yeah, that's just important. So preventative measures, and I think that again, I'd like to kind of go back to, I know we're talking about a subject where we're going into dismissals and disciplinaries and all that kind of thing, but ultimately, I suppose from a HR perspective, we are starting from a place that we've hired this person, we thought they were a good fit.
Yeah,
maybe there's another route.
Yeah, exactly. And maybe we need to look at our onboarding process, or maybe we need to look at our selection process in our hiring. These are all kind of really, really important pieces that support you bringing the right person into the role with the right set of skills to be successful. So we need to give some consideration to that. But just in relation to the preventative and the whole area of mediation, you'll see, and it's great, the WRC publish really, really comprehensive reports. Their site is very, very good. I definitely would recommend people to access it more often. They report on cases, and we know, of course, now that the media can report on any case, that it's all the cases going to the WRC are open unless otherwise. But very often when you see cases that come forward in the WRC and where there is compensation to the individual for unfair dismissal, it's not the sanction of the dismissal for the incident, it's the process wasn't followed. So you have your policy and procedure, and yet you didn't follow it. And I think that's where the WRC adjudicating officers really get frustrated with employers. So again, just for us to be mindful of that, we should know better. And so just take our time, go through the stages and make those informed decisions, and stand over the decision. Like I find, and I know we have a summary slide just on some of the final tips, but that final piece when you get to making a decision, am I satisfied that if I was asked if I was in front of a third party, and I was asked about what I did and how I made my informed decision, am I satisfied I have all the evidence there? Because it comes down to that at the end of the day,
And I think that's the key, is you're going to be the one answering questions. And
have I got my notes? Did I follow the procedure? Have I got the chain of communications, making sure that I made everybody aware of what stage we were at and all of that?
I actually really like the idea of, and it was really simple, but if anybody was to take anything from today is when you're going through that process, every single stage to send the copy of your process. So everybody knows what's going on.
Yeah.
Or what
And this
it's
is
going to
where
look
we
like.
are. Yeah, this is where we are. Yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah.
I think this is something that people often forget is when you lose a team member or something has happened, you have people left behind. And how does that actually affect a number of things? Your team members, your culture, if you've had to fire that person. And then also we do live in a world of lots of social media and things like that. So in terms of your brand reputation, if somebody's gone on and left a bad review on Glassdoor or something like that, these are all factors not to stop dismissal, but to be aware of, I suppose.
Absolutely. Like, this is a known goal, really, that we shouldn't do. So tough decisions have to be made. Absolutely. And you're not going to get the consensus of all your team to say that was the right decision. So you have to make that decision. So that's what they're paying you for.
Yeah.
To make those informed decisions and to be able to carry them out. So, and I think ultimately people will respect you for it. Okay. But if you're afraid to make the decision, or you shy away from the decision and you just kind of head in the sand sort of thing, that is like a cancer that just will erode the soul and the culture of the organization. Because you know what that's saying ultimately, if you are a non-performer, it's okay. If you behave badly, it's okay. And then you have this individual who's a high achiever, who's really talented, really ambitious, passionate about what they're doing, and they think, but I'm in the wrong environment here. I'm not getting recognized. I'm swimming against the tide here because others think it's okay and my manager is not correcting that. So really tough decisions are a time when our moral compass, our company culture, and our values really play out. That's when we demonstrate what we're about when it comes to these tough decisions.
Mm-hmm.
And shying away from it is really a missed opportunity.
Yeah, I think that's just where leadership comes in as well. We're very conscious of time and we've loads of questions as well. So if we just do a quick whistle stop on the conclusion, and I might just take one or two questions. But in terms of, I suppose, if you were to leave us with something today, Frederica, for people to kind of go with.
The big thing I would say is dismissal is a big deal. Don't rush into it. Okay, honestly, you need to have absolutely a robust, and you need to demonstrate a process sitting behind it, even if it's a gross misconduct and you think that it's a black and white situation. Make sure you have a full process sitting behind it, that you've done all the different things that you should have done, and make sure that everybody knows, you know, what set expectations, that, you know, somebody can't say to you, well, I never knew that, I was only borrowing it, you know, or I didn't know it wasn't possible. I saw others, you know, taking food from the canteen.
It was resting in my account.
Yeah, you know, just you set expectations really, really clearly. I think it's important in HR, as it is in being a manager, to show empathy. All right, these are difficult things. Nobody, you know, comes to the table on a matter of performance or behavior, anything to do with dismissal or disciplinary, with, you know, lightheartedly, you know. So it is, so show respect and give everybody dignity in the process, and have a level of empathy in the time in how you show up and how you engage. Really important for us in the HR field to be open-minded. So we have to make sure that we're not going to get swayed by groupthink or unconscious bias, or by prejudging a situation. You know, that person has a really bad record down there, and now something else has come up and we're saying, yeah, but they've always been a troublemaker. They might always be a troublemaker, but that doesn't necessarily mean they're guilty of this particular situation, you know. So just that, be absolutely remain as objective as possible. The planning piece, I know I've said this already, put put time and effort into this early stage, you will benefit later on. Make sure you communicate the minutes of meetings. Give people time to be prepared for the meeting. Like, even if that means it's pushed out by another week, so it's another week. But you want to get this to the end of the line in the right way. You know, if you rush it and you find that the person feels that they were disadvantaged and you end up having a WRC case, you're going to spend more than a week putting your papers together to defend it. Now, you might win it, but you're going to spend more than a week doing all of that. Have all the necessary information, and then I think we need to make sure that the people that we're putting into positions who are engaging with this sort of process or are managing these processes, whether it's HR or whether it's line managers or team leaders, we need to make sure that they're trained and they have the skills to do it. So support them to do this well. And then ultimately, you know, what we do, how we do it is the ultimate demonstration of who we are as an organization. And so, you know, pay attention to some of those things as well.
Yeah, and I wrote down one word was dignified, and I think that that's really important. It's difficult for everybody. An issue has happened, but you're in control of how you present yourself in the company, and you need to be dignified throughout the process. I think is important.
Yeah, wherever you are in that process.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Frederica, thank you so much for being with us today. We have a load of questions we didn't get to, but what I'm going to do is kind of put them into different brackets, and Frederica doesn't know this yet, but fire them off to her for her answer and send them in the email later.
Okay.
But so for people to contact you, Frederica, is the best way to get it through LinkedIn or
go very
to the
happy,
website?
Delighted to take anything that comes through LinkedIn, obviously. But we have our website, voltage.ie, and we have my contact details are there. The company contact details there. Send us an email, give us a call. Yeah, very happy to respond to anything that anybody might have in relation to this topic, and just, I suppose, effective management of people in a broader sense. But it's been a great opportunity to chat to you about it, Christelle, and thanks so much to HRLocker team for this opportunity. Definitely a loaded topic, and one that we are inevitably going to encounter throughout our careers at some point or other. So it's no harm to open up the conversations around this, because I think that's where we really learn, you know, because your policies, yes, tell you lots, but I think it's through conversations and exploring, you know, what would you suggest here? How might you do that? This is what I did. I think that's the real learning ground for all of us.
Yeah, I agree. Next time, Frederica, we have you on, I promise I'll give you a nicer topic. And giving people bonuses or something. But thank you very much, and thank you for your time.